Ethical subjectivism is a kind of ethical relativism. It's called subjectivism because it claims that the belief of the individual or the subject who is considering whether or not a given action is moral or immoral, and the belief of the individual subject who's considering whether or not a moral claim is true or false, the belief is what determines whether that action is moral or immoral. The individual's belief is what determines whether or not that moral claim is true or false. Their believing it's true makes it true. Their believing it's the moral thing to do makes it the moral thing to do. So let's look at an argument in favor of ethical subjectivism and evaluate it. One such argument might begin with a premise like this: when different people have different moral codes, there is no objective standard that can be used to judge one person's code as better than another. Our own moral code, therefore, has no special status. There is no universal truth in ethics. The moral code of the individual person determines what is right for that person. Individual belief is the right-making feature of the action. Now, think really carefully about this premise, because it's sort of deceptive here. This isn't saying each person gets permission to decide what the right thing to do is. It's not saying that. It's saying the belief of each individual person about what the right thing to do is what makes that thing the right thing to do. So if I believe it's the right thing to do, according to the subjectivist, that makes it the right thing to do. If I believe that a particular moral claim is true, my belief makes that moral claim true. Therefore, we should reject arrogance and adopt an attitude of tolerance toward the practices of others. Okay, so when we're evaluating these different arguments in support of ethical theories, one thing we might do is evaluate how effectively the theory will allow us to bridge the is-ought gap. Remember, what we're looking for is an ethical theory that will allow us to identify what we should do and what kinds of conditions we should seek to bring about based on what we know to be the case. And we want to be able to do that as effectively as possible so that someone doesn't simply dismiss our moral claims out of hand by saying, well, that's like just your opinion, man. Okay? And this is going to be a problem for ethical subjectivism, right? Because ethical subjectivism begins with the assumption that the only thing there is opinion. Okay, the world's full of opinions, and the world doesn't contain any way of evaluating those opinions against one another to determine if some are better than others. Okay, in ethical subjectivism, the individual gets to decide what the moral thing to do is, and their decision makes that the right thing to do. Okay, another way to evaluate the arguments in favor of these different ethical theories is to think about the implications of the arguments. If we accept this argument, if we accept this theory, what are some of the consequences? And one consequence of subjectivism is this: it's going to be really difficult to make a meaningful claim that Martin Luther King Jr. was a better human being, a more moral human being than Adolf Hitler. Okay, according to the subjectivist, the best I can say is like, well, this is what I believe. But if I'm going to be consistent to be as an ethical subjectivist, I would have to say that your belief that Adolf Hitler was a more moral man than Martin Luther King is also true. It's true for you. You have your truth, I have my truth, and there is no way to distinguish between the value of our competing truth and whether or not one of our truths is better than the other. Another thing we might do when we're considering and evaluating these arguments for these various ethical theories is to look at the premise statements really carefully. The premise statements are the statements that are leading to a conclusion. Okay? And if all of the premise statements are accepted as true and the conclusion logically follows from those statements, then we would have to accept the conclusion as true as well. But if we can identify premise statements that could be false, that we could question, then that gives us reason to reject the argument. Okay, so here, the first premise seems to be true. Different people do, in fact, have different moral codes. Okay, but the next couple of premises, or next few premises, we could challenge those. I don't know that it's the case that there's no objective standard that can be used to judge one person's moral code as better than another. And if that's questionable, then it's also questionable that our own moral code has no special status. Because if there isn't a standard that I can use to evaluate competing moral codes, then maybe my own moral code is inferior to someone else's. And I don't know that it's the case that there are no universal truths in ethics. Maybe there are. And if there are, this whole argument sort of falls apart. Now, there's another interesting feature of this argument that's important to recognize. Oftentimes, people embrace subjectivism because of its conclusion here. Okay, subjectivism seems to have this kind of veneer of tolerance and inclusivity. It's like, hey man, to each his own. We want a diversity of opinion. Who am I to tell you what's right or wrong? But that final claim or the final conclusion here seems to undercut the very premises that it led to it. Because the final conclusion here seems to be an ethical claim about what others should do. We should reject arrogance and adopt an attitude of tolerance. That sounds like an ethical claim to me. And according to subjectivism, there isn't the ability to make a moral claim about what's right for others. I can only say what's right for me. And whatever I say is right for me is right for me. Okay? So ethical subjectivism, this argument, this rendition of it, has some problems. Okay? But nonetheless, if we choose to embrace ethical subjectivism, what we would be doing is placing as our ultimate value individual belief. Individual belief is what matters the most. So when I make to you a moral claim, and that moral claim expresses what I actually believe, my belief is what makes the moral claim true, because individual belief matters most. We can use ethical subjectivism to deal with the Cookie Monster women, the dumbest girls who stole the cookie money, okay? And an argument using subjectivism to address this situation might look like this. My moral claims are true because I believe them. That's the foundational principle of subjectivism. I believe stealing money is morally wrong. I believe morally wrong actions should be condemned and sometimes punished. The dumbest girls stole money from the girl selling Girl Scout cookies. Therefore, what the dumbest girls did was morally wrong, and they should be condemned and punished. Okay? Now, maybe we agree with that conclusion. The question for us is, do we agree with that conclusion because we agree with the premises? And we would have to agree with all of them. Do you see any premises here that might be challenged? My moral claims are true because I believe them, says the psychopath. Yeah, that's a really dangerous assertion to accept, isn't it? Because if we accept that my moral claims are true because I believe them, then doesn't it have to be the case that we would have to allow others to have their moral claims simply because they believe them, regardless of what those moral claims are? Okay? So you can see subjectivism has some issues.